London learned cruelty early, and it practiced it best beneath crystal light. On the night Eleanor Harrowby returned to the season, the chandeliers burned like judgment, throwing every whisper into relief. Silk skirts rustled away from her path. Fans lifted, then closed. A laugh, sharpened to a blade, found her ear and lingered. She had come dressed in restraint. Ivory satin, modest lace, a throat left bare of jewels. Yet restraint was no armor against a word once learned by the room: unwed. Eleanor held herself as she always did, with a stillness earned through loss. Her eyes, gray as rain on stone, did not search for pity. They counted steps, exits, courtesies. She knew where the mothers stood guard and where daughters were steered aside, trained to fear contamination. She knew the etiquette of exile. When a gentleman bowed, it was brief. When he offered his arm, it was withdrawn with an apology rehearsed for this precise cruelty. The music began, a waltz too hopeful for the hour. Eleanor accepted one dance because refusal would have been noticed, and notice was its own violence. She moved with a grace that betrayed her breeding and the discipline of endurance. Halfway through, her partner's smile thinned. He remembered himself. The set concluded without her. Hands unclasped, the floor flowed on, leaving her where she stood, a solitary figure marooned by propriety. There were eyes upon her then, measuring, correcting, erasing. Eleanor did not look for him. She had learned not to imagine rescue. But somewhere beyond the crush, a man observed with a patience foreign to ballrooms. He did not smile. He did not turn away. He watched as one watches weather approach, noting not spectacle but consequence. Eleanor departed early, as she always did, collecting dignity from the floor where it had been dropped. At the threshold, rain breathed cold upon her cheeks, and the marble steps shone treacherous as ice. Her slipper, loosened by hours of careful restraint, slipped free as she descended. She did not stop. To pause would have been to kneel, and kneeling was a posture society demanded of her too often already. The carriage swallowed her, the door shut, and London resumed its music. Behind her, on white stone marked by rain, the small ivory slipper lay abandoned, unremarkable, unadorned, faithful to the shape of a woman who had learned to walk forward without witnesses. A gloved hand reached for it, lifted it gently, and for the first time that night, judgment yielded to attention. He stood apart from the noise, a duke by bearing if not yet by name, his presence arranging space around him. Titles had failed to teach him mercy, but observation had taught him truth. The slipper weighed little, yet it carried a knight's arithmetic. The subtraction of kindness, the division of rumor, the remainder of courage. He did not ask whose it was. He did not summon servants. He closed his fingers and felt resolve settle, quiet and exacting, like a lock turned at last. Across the city, Eleanor pressed her palms together and breathed until the carriage lamps blurred. She told herself that nothing had changed, that tomorrow would be the same long corridor of glances and omissions. Still, an unbidden warmth lingered, as if somewhere a candle had been lit against the dark. And in that small mercy of flame, unseen and unpromised, the night took note. It was not love, nor rescue, nor even hope, but attention, rare and dangerous, and it would change the music of rooms yet to come. For Eleanor, and for him, the season had begun anew. Together, by morning, the city had sharpened its tongue. Drawing rooms bloomed with conjecture, and the name Eleanor Harrowby traveled on breaths scented with tea and triumph. She learned of it indirectly, as women like her always did. A pause too long at the modistes, a look exchanged over her shoulder, a kindness withheld as if newly rationed. Something had shifted, and London delighted in the work of explanation. 3 refusals arrived before noon. They were delivered with exquisite courtesy, each phrase to flatter the rejected lady while offering nothing in return. Lord Hemsley's daughter wept. The Viscountess Crane took to her bed. A dowager laughed too loudly and swore the Duke had grown eccentric with wealth. His name was spoken everywhere, because it was safer to speak of him than to speak of Eleanor, whose presence still burned the air. Eleanor herself kept to the narrow safety of routine. She walked, wrote, waited. Her child slept far from the city, a truth she held like a stone in her pocket. When the knock came, she expected a summons meant to wound, an invitation extended only to be withdrawn. Instead, there was a parcel, wrapped plainly, addressed in a hand both steady and unfamiliar. Inside lay lilies of the valley, restrained and white, their scent a quiet insistence. No card explained them. No flourish claimed them. Eleanor closed the box and felt the room tilt, not with joy but with the vertigo of being seen. She told herself it was a mistake, a servant's error, a prank conceived by boredom. Yet the flowers remained, faithful as breath, asking nothing. The Duke, meanwhile, moved through his house as one moves through a well-ordered mind. He rose early, refused breakfast invitations, and dismissed advice with calm finality. The slipper lay where he had placed it, neither hidden nor displayed. He had measured its wear, noted the plainness of its stitching, the patience of its shape. It did not belong to a girl trained for spectacle. It belonged to a woman trained to endure. When he declined the fourth proposal, he did so publicly. The room hushed, startled by restraint where drama had been expected. He spoke of obligation, of conscience, of the danger of choosing comfort over truth. The words were mild, yet they unsettled the walls. Eyes turned, searching for a cause, and found Eleanor's absence like a bruise. By evening, an invitation arrived bearing the Duke's seal. Eleanor read it twice, then a third time aloud, as if sound might alter meaning. She stood at her window and watched rain gather itself on the glass, remembering marble steps and a night that had not ended. The lilies leaned toward the light. Somewhere in the city, a man had chosen attention over approval, and London was beginning to understand that scandal, once loosed, would not be recalled. It would test her composure and his resolve, asking whether dignity could survive repetition and whether mercy, once noticed, could be sustained. Eleanor folded the letter, her hands steady despite the tremor beneath, and felt the familiar choice rise before her, to retreat into silence or to step forward and be named. She set the flowers by the window, where rain-thin light touched their bells, and considered how easily a token becomes a rumor. Outside, wheels passed, carrying judgments rehearsed and ready. Inside, a woman weighed courage against cost, and somewhere opposite her thoughts, a man prepared to speak again. The night listened, patient and exacting, as the city held its breath, sensing that the next step would echo beyond any ballroom and all doors. The gallery beyond the ballroom held its breath, a long corridor of portraits and shadow where sound thinned to courtesy. Eleanor entered as one enters water, composed yet alert, the hush touching her skin. He waited near a tall window, hands loosely clasped, the city's rain turning glass to silver. He bowed, not deeply, not coldly, as though distance were a matter of respect. Her name passed between them with care, and in the pause that followed, expectation softened into something like permission. Neither smiled, yet neither retreated, and the room seemed to tilt toward them alone, quietly, waiting there. They spoke first of trivialities, weather and travel, the safe scaffolding of manners. His voice was even, carrying neither apology nor claim, and she answered with measured grace. When silence returned, it did not accuse. He reached into his coat and produced the slipper, wrapped in linen, presenting it without spectacle. Eleanor inhaled, a small sound she could not stop. The object rested between them like a truth set down. He said he had noticed how she left, how she did not look back, how endurance can appear mistaken for pride. It unsettled him deeply and compelled his careful attention. Eleanor steadied herself by the window, rain's cadence recalling nights of vigil and resolve. She told him, simply, that the child existed, that the choice had been hers alone, and that she had accepted the cost without bitterness. She did not plead. She did not excuse. Her hands remained still. The words fell with the weight of vows once broken elsewhere. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his breath controlled, as though listening were an act of discipline learned long ago and honored now. In that listening, a private tribunal convened, and mercy was admitted without objection by him. He spoke then, not of forgiveness, but of seeing clearly. He said that courage often wears the wrong name, and that society mistakes obedience for virtue. He returned the slipper to her hands, not as a claim, but as recognition. Eleanor felt the linen warm, as if the object had learned patience. Their proximity held, charged yet restrained. Outside, thunder muttered. Inside, a line shifted. She realized she was no longer alone with her story. Someone else had chosen to bear its sound. The knowledge frightened her and steadied him, binding consequence to intention without spectacle or retreat from either. They parted without promise, which felt honest. Eleanor returned to the ballroom long enough to be seen leaving, her spine aligned with resolve. The Duke remained, and when pressed again, he refused calmly, naming principle rather than preference. Murmurs spread like ink. Eleanor heard of it later and closed her eyes, bracing for consequence. The city had been challenged, not with noise, but with clarity. That night, she slept poorly, not from fear alone, but from the ache of recognition still warming her palms. Somewhere, resolve gathered momentum, demanding witness, endurance, and a public answer soon enough from them both. The next invitation arrived with fewer words and greater weight. Eleanor read it standing, feeling the house listen. She considered absence as armor, then rejected it. To decline would concede the narrative to those who fed on omission. She prepared with care, choosing simplicity again, choosing herself. Across the city, the Duke rehearsed nothing. He believed preparation belonged to deceit. He intended to speak only what he could stand to repeat. Between them stretched a narrow bridge of intention, delicate, demanding, and newly visible. It promised crossing and threatened collapse, without permission from anyone watching closely, hungrily, in silence alone. At the gathering, conversation thinned as if oxygen had been withdrawn. Eleanor felt eyes, but did not flinch. She stood where she was meant to stand and waited. The Duke crossed the room deliberately, not to rescue, but to align. He greeted her with the same courtesy he offered kings. They spoke little. Their nearness declared enough. She sensed the room recalculating, startled by restraint. When he asked for her company, it sounded like an invitation to witness, not an escape from judgment. A hush followed, heavy with risk, and the knight leaned closer to hear truth spoken plainly soon. In a smaller room, removed from applause, he spoke again, repeating nothing rehearsed, repeating only conviction. He named her courage without spectacle and acknowledged the child without shame. Eleanor felt fear surge, then settle, replaced by a steadier warmth. This was not absolution offered downward. It was alignment offered cross. She answered with honesty equal to his. The exchange altered them both. Outside the door, society waited, poised to crown or censure, unaware that its verdict had already been outpaced. They stood briefly, absorbing consequence, choosing presence over retreat, and preparing for return together, visibly, into the light without armor. When they emerged, murmurs sharpened, then stalled. The Duke spoke once more, publicly this time, his tone unchanged. He declined another claim upon his future, citing principle and naming it plainly. Eleanor felt the weight of that word land and stay. Faces rearranged themselves. Some hardened, some softened. The city did not cheer. It measured. Eleanor understood, then, that endurance had taught her patience, but courage would require visibility. The shift was complete. Secrecy had given way to stance. Whatever followed would be witnessed, contested, and remembered because it had been chosen by them both in full view of London. Later, alone again, Eleanor felt the tremor catch up with her. She sat, breathing through it, and allowed herself one small kindness, belief. Not certainty, not rescue, but belief that attention could endure repetition. Across the city, the Duke set the slipper back into linen, not to hide it, but to keep it ready. Tomorrow would demand declaration with cost. Tonight offered only resolve. The city slept uneasily, sensing that a reckoning had been scheduled, and that Mercy, once noticed, intended to speak. It would not whisper, nor ask permission, when daylight came and doors opened to consequence ahead. Waiting, London gathered as if summoned by weather. The great ballroom brightened beyond comfort, mirrors multiplying chandeliers until light felt interrogative. Eleanor entered without haste, carrying herself as one carries a truth already tested. Murmurs rose, then thinned, recalibrating to her composure. Mothers paused, daughters measured, men pretended industry. The Duke stood opposite, still as a compass needle waiting north. Between them stretched the floor, polished to reflection, demanding choice. Eleanor felt the old urge to retreat, acknowledged it, and remained, letting presence become a statement before speech arrived. Her heart counted breaths, steadying courage beneath silk, and practiced restraint alone. The orchestra resumed, strings lifting hope, then setting it down carefully, and Eleanor crossed the room. Each step answered rumor with fact. The Duke moved at the same moment, not hastening, not yielding. They met beneath a chandelier whose crystals chimed faintly, as if aware. He bowed. She inclined her head. No smile softened the exchange. He spoke her name clearly, granting it space. She replied, and the sound steadied her. Around them, conversation faltered, listening despite itself, learning that restraint could command attention better than spectacle ever dared. Eyes widened, fans stilled, judgments postponed, breath held in velvet air. He offered his arm, a gesture formal enough to be safe and bold enough to matter. Eleanor hesitated the length of a heartbeat, then accepted, feeling the room recalibrate again. They moved together through the waltz's measured turns, neither performing affection nor denying alignment. His hand remained correct, his gaze attentive without possession. She felt steadier within the pattern, the music lending structure to courage. Whispers chased them, found no purchase. When the dance ended, he did not release her at once, choosing intention over convenience. The pause spoke louder than vows, unsettling those trained to read exits and etiquette. In the quiet that followed, he addressed the room, not loudly, but with a tone that carried. He named principle as his guide and declined further introductions. The refusal landed without flourish, altering balances. Eleanor felt the floor firm beneath her feet. A woman nearby scoffed. Another looked away, thoughtful. The Duke turned back to Eleanor, asking her leave to escort her aside. She consented, understanding the cost. They moved into a smaller chamber, where firelight warmed restraint and shadows granted privacy. There, breath slowed, consequences clarified, and courage found a quieter voice and waiting hearts. He spoke first, acknowledging the city's gaze and refusing its terms. He said he would not ask Eleanor to diminish herself to soothe others. The words were plain, their effect profound. Eleanor answered with equal candor, naming her child and the life she would not disown. She did not beg. She stood. He listened, absorbing consequence. When he replied, he spoke of choosing truth publicly and companionship privately, should she accept both. The offer contained no rescue, only partnership forged in daylight. She felt fear yield to steadier resolve, fragile yet durable under scrutiny that refused mercy but honored courage. They returned together, not entwined, simply aligned. The room registered the change with unease. The Duke spoke again, declining a final proposal with courtesy and finality, naming conscience and consequence. Eleanor sensed the rupture widen. Some faces hardened, others softened. All were altered. Music attempted recovery and failed. Eleanor felt grief for what would be lost and relief for what would not be surrendered. The Duke met her eyes once, a promise unspoken yet binding. The night accepted the new terms, reluctantly, precisely. Applause did not come, but silence held its own verdict heavy, instructive, and unforgettable for everyone present. Later, Eleanor stood by a window, the city's breath fogging glass. She measured cost without flinching. The Duke approached, speaking softly of next steps taken openly. He would not hide her, nor ask her to hide herself. She nodded, feeling the weight settle. Outside, carriages departed carrying stories sharpened for retelling. Eleanor understood endurance had brought her here. Courage would carry her forward. She touched the sill, grounding herself, and turned to him, ready to be seen again. The future loomed unsoftened, yet choice had cleared its outline. She inhaled, accepting consequence, companionship, and public truth without armor at last. The Duke watched her choose, understanding that alignment demanded repetition. He offered his hand again, not as command but invitation. Eleanor placed hers within it, briefly, publicly, then released it. The gesture echoed. Judgment gathered, recalculated, and waited. He spoke one final sentence to the room, affirming his intention to proceed openly. The words closed doors and opened a narrower passage. Eleanor felt the corridor form before her. It frightened her less than the silence she had survived. She stepped forward. Gasps followed, then quiet, then an accounting of loyalties. Eleanor stood centered, breathing steadily, prepared for consequence and witness. Night thinned as they departed, rain cooling stone. Eleanor felt the ache of endings and the lift of beginnings interlace. The Duke matched her pace, saying little, trusting action. The city would answer tomorrow with censure or curiosity, perhaps both. For now, resolve sufficed. Eleanor thought of her child, of truth carried without apology. She felt the unfamiliar mercy of being chosen without erasure. Carriage lamps blurred, and London receded, still murmuring, unable to decide whether courage was contagious. The question followed them, insistent, sharpening anticipation with every turn. Eleanor remained upright, hands folded, ready for daylight's verdict together, unhidden. Alone later, Eleanor removed her gloves and felt the tremor arrive. She did not fight it. She believed attention could endure repetition now, though belief demanded proof. Across the city, the Duke prepared to stand again, publicly, without ornament. Tomorrow would require names and costs. Tonight had given stance. Eleanor set her slippers side by side and extinguished the lamp. The dark held promise and threat in equal measure. She slept knowing the declaration had been made and the reckoning would come. Dawn waited, exacting, ready to test courage against consequence. The city stirred, preparing judgment, mercy, or both soon. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with consequence, with doors left unopened and glances sharpened by certainty. Eleanor rose early, the city's murmur already pressing against the windows, and dressed with deliberate calm. The mirror offered no comfort, only truth, a woman who had chosen visibility and must now endure what it invited. She thought of her child, of small hands grasping air and sleep, and felt resolve settle into her bones. Whatever London intended, she would meet it upright. The Duke arrived without herald or ceremony, as he had promised. His presence steadied the room, not by authority alone, but by an attention that did not waver. They spoke little. Words had been spent honestly already. He offered the carriage, and she accepted, understanding that the journey ahead would be measured not in distance, but in witness. As they moved through the streets, faces turned. Some watched with curiosity, others with contempt. The city practiced its judgments openly now, freed from whisper. At the estate beyond the city's edge, air widened and light softened. Eleanor felt space open within her as well. The Duke's house was not grand for display. It was ordered for living. He led her through rooms where restraint felt like care rather than omission. When he spoke of his intention, it was plain. He would petition openly, acknowledging her child, refusing euphemism. He would not ask society's permission to honor truth. Eleanor listened, fear flaring, then settling into something like relief. This was the shape of courage she could recognize, quiet, repeatable, and costly. They walked the grounds, gravel sounding beneath measured steps. Eleanor confessed the ache she carried, the fear that her child would inherit scorn. The Duke stopped, turned to her fully, and answered without haste. He said inheritance was shaped by witness, not rumor, and that children learn dignity by seeing it lived. The words did not erase fear, but they offered ground. Eleanor felt the last of her retreating instincts loosen their grip. She was no longer alone with the burden of explanation. News traveled faster than carriages. By afternoon, refusals hardened into exclusions. Invitations vanished. Allies hesitated. Eleanor felt the cost accumulate and did not look away. She sat with the Duke and wrote letters that named truth without defense. He sent his own, refusing compromise. Each seal pressed felt like a door closing and another opening narrower, more exacting. When the final reply arrived, cool, condemning, Eleanor exhaled. The waiting had been heavier than the answer. They traveled to the countryside together, where green held and judgment thinned. There, Eleanor's child ran toward her, unafraid, laughter bright against wind. The Duke knelt, not to perform humility, but to meet innocence at eye level. He spoke simply, introducing himself without title, offering presence rather than promise. Eleanor watched fear drain from her chest. This was the climax she had not imagined. Not applause, but alignment made visible to the one witness who mattered most. London answered eventually, as it always does, with recalibration. Some doors reopened cautiously. Others remained closed. Eleanor returned when she chose, not when summoned. She stood beside the Duke at a small gathering, acknowledged without enthusiasm but without erasure. He spoke when necessary, declined when prudent, and never softened truth to soothe discomfort. Eleanor found her voice in this rhythm, learning when silence was strength and when speech was duty. The city adjusted, slow and resentful, but it adjusted. The proposal came without spectacle, on an ordinary afternoon, when light fell honest and unadorned. The Duke spoke of partnership, of choosing again and again under scrutiny. Eleanor answered with equal clarity. She accepted without illusion, knowing love would require repetition and courage would be tested daily. The union did not transform London, but it transformed the terms under which Eleanor walked its streets. She was no longer an object of rumor, but a subject of her own life. Their marriage was quiet. No chandeliers bore witness. No crowd gathered to approve. Yet news spread, and with it, a recalculation that reached further than applause ever could. Eleanor felt the past loosen its grip. She did not forget humiliation. She repurposed it into empathy and steadiness. The Duke watched her claim space without apology and learned that leadership could be gentle without losing force. In time, Eleanor stood at a window, once more, the city breathing beyond glass. She thought of the slipper of attention noticed and held. She understood now that love had arrived not as rescue, but as recognition sustained. The Duke joined her, saying nothing, presence sufficient. Together they watched dusk settle, unafraid of what daylight might demand next. London would remember the scandal, then forget its details, as it always does. What endured was quieter, a woman who chose visibility, a man who chose truth, and a child who learned dignity by watching both. Eleanor rested her hand on the sill and felt peace arrive without permission. It was not triumph. It was alignment, hard-won and sufficient. The night closed gently, and for the first time, the future did not feel like a trial, but a life chosen together.